Welcome to the new video of NeuroPhilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The misunderstood enemy. Most people grow up hearing that the ego is their enemy. It's the voice of arrogance, the source of conflict, the wall that separates us from peace. Pop culture, spiritual movements, and self-help gurus have all repeated the same line: kill the ego. It sounds noble, even heroic, to imagine oneself transcending the ego and living in pure harmony. But what if this popular belief is completely wrong? What if the ego, far from being a villain, is actually the foundation that makes consciousness possible? Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest minds in depth psychology, never saw the ego as something to be destroyed. For him, it was a vital psychic organ, the part of us that says, I am. Without the ego, there would be no awareness, no personal identity, no ability to navigate reality. It is through the ego that we build a coherent sense of self, a story of who we are and how we exist in the world. It is our psychic compass. Yet, somewhere along the way, humanity distorted this truth. The ego was blamed for all suffering, and in trying to silence it, we only deepened our confusion. The problem, Jung explained, is not the existence of the ego, but the corruption of it. The ego was never meant to rule, it was meant to serve. It was designed to be the ambassador of the self, the deeper, wiser, and timeless core of our being. When balanced, the ego helps us translate the vastness of the inner world into action in the outer world. It allows us to make decisions, set boundaries, and engage with life consciously. But when the ego forgets its role as a servant and tries to become the master, everything begins to fall apart. This is the tragedy of modern existence. The ego, instead of being a bridge, becomes a barrier. It starts to cling to control, image, and external validation. It identifies not with the living truth of who we are, but with the roles we perform, the persona we present to please others or to survive rejection. Jung called this pathological state ego inflation, when consciousness fuses completely with its own mask. In an inflated state, the individual no longer lives, they perform. Every moment becomes a stage where the ego rehearses its favorite role: the successful one, the spiritual one, the victim, the savior, the genius. Behind each mask lies the same fragile fear: if they see who I really am, I'll be rejected. The tragedy is that the more the mask is praised by society, the harder it becomes to remove. The person becomes addicted to their own performance. This chronic performance has a terrible cost. It drains emotional energy, breeds anxiety, and creates a constant sense of emptiness. The more one tries to maintain an image, the less connection they feel to their own inner life. The inflated ego builds a kingdom of mirrors, but each reflection is hollow. People living in this state often describe feeling like imposters in their own skin, admired on the outside but hollow within. The consequences ripple through every layer of life. Relationships become transactional, driven by the need for affirmation. Success becomes an endless treadmill. And internally, there's a growing fatigue, not physical, but existential. The ego's obsession with control and perfection suffocates spontaneity, creativity, and joy. Life becomes a checklist of appearances instead of an unfolding of essence. Jung observed that when the ego loses its connection to the self, it becomes tyrannical. It begins to treat all experiences, love, failure, emotion, even dreams, as threats to its fragile rule. It suppresses vulnerability and denies imperfection because those qualities expose its illusion of control. But what it suppresses does not disappear, it sinks into the unconscious, waiting to return with greater force. Thus, the more one tries to perfect their image, the more their shadow, the repressed side of the psyche, grows in darkness and power. In this way, the ego's attempt to protect us ends up imprisoning us. We become trapped in roles that once kept us safe but now suffocate our growth. We become performers in our own lives, smiling on command, apologizing for existing, chasing praise like oxygen. And when the applause fades, we collapse into quiet despair, unsure of who we are without the audience. Jung warned that the modern world encourages this inflation. Social systems reward image over authenticity, performance over presence. The ego learns early that survival depends on appearing competent, beautiful, spiritual, or successful. But in trying to be seen, we stop being. We lose the thread that ties us to our deeper reality, the self, the inner source of meaning and wholeness. So, what is the solution? Not to destroy the ego, but to transform it. To guide it back to its original function, as the mediator between our inner truth and the external world. The healthy ego does not shout, it listens. It does not control, it collaborates. It does not inflate itself with illusion, it grounds itself in reality. Jung believed that the first step toward this transformation is awareness. To simply see when the ego is playing a role, when it is chasing validation, when it is protecting a false identity. Such moments of honest observation are small awakenings, glimpses of the self peering through the cracks of the mask. Over time, these glimpses widen into windows of consciousness. To reclaim a healthy ego is to remember that you are not your image, not your mask, and not your performance. You are the one who observes them. The ego is not your enemy, it is your instrument. But it must be tuned. It must learn humility before the self. The journey begins with this understanding. The goal is not to silence the ego, but to restore its rightful place, not as a tyrant demanding worship, but as a loyal servant of something far wiser, deeper, and more real. The prison of possession. There comes a moment in life when the mask fits too tightly, when the image you built to survive begins to suffocate the person you truly are. You look in the mirror and see a stranger who smiles on command, who performs emotions rather than feels them. That is the moment the ego has ceased to be a tool and has become a prison. Carl Jung called this ego possession. It is not a metaphor but a precise description of a psychological state. When possessed, the ego no longer serves consciousness, it is consciousness. You don't just have an ego anymore, the ego has you. Every thought, reaction, and decision becomes filtered through the need to preserve an image. Life itself becomes an endless campaign to appear consistent, admired, and in control. This condition often hides in plain sight. The possessed ego can seem perfectly successful. It manages careers, social lives, and appearances with precision. It posts photos of happiness and writes eloquently about purpose. Yet, beneath this polished surface lies a quiet exhaustion, an emptiness no amount of validation can fill. Because what the possessed ego truly fears is not failure or criticism, but exposure. It trembles at the thought of being seen without its mask. Jung wrote that this state is one of the most dangerous in the human psyche. When the ego believes itself to be the totality of the self, it cuts off connection to the unconscious, the living source of renewal and creativity. It becomes like a king who, convinced he is the entire kingdom, isolates himself in a fortress of mirrors. Everything outside the reflection feels like a threat. From that moment, every challenge becomes an attack, every disagreement an insult, every loss a collapse of identity. The possessed ego cannot differentiate between the end of an image and the end of existence. It reacts to criticism not with understanding but with rage or withdrawal. It is hypersensitive, perpetually defending a fragile narrative of superiority, spirituality, intelligence, or moral purity. And yet, the cruel irony is that this same ego, obsessed with control, is utterly controlled itself. It is driven by fear, not power. Fear of rejection, of insignificance, of dissolving into the unknown. So it doubles down. It constructs a life made of routines, reputations, and predictable outcomes. It keeps the mind busy, the calendar full, and the soul numb. Anything that threatens the illusion of mastery must be avoided or suppressed. To outsiders, this can look like ambition or confidence. But inside, the possessed ego lives in constant vigilance. It polices thought and emotion. It demands that you never falter, never doubt, never reveal weakness. It whispers, if they see your cracks, you'll lose everything. This inner dictator maintains its rule not through violence but through persuasion, by convincing you that you are the mask. That is why the ego's possession is so insidious. It offers comfort. It tells you who you are and what to do. It gives structure and meaning, even if both are hollow. Many people would rather remain enslaved to this illusion than face the terrifying freedom of not knowing who they are. The ego's prison, Jung observed, has no visible walls. Its bars are made of habit, fear, and pride. The lock is self-justification. And the guard is the very voice that insists you are free. Inside this prison, the soul slowly starves. The joy of spontaneity fades. Creativity turns mechanical. Even love becomes conditional, traded like currency for reassurance. The possessed ego cannot truly love, because love demands surrender, vulnerability, and the willingness to be changed. To love is to risk exposure, and that is something the ego cannot permit. Jung saw this phenomenon everywhere, in politics, religion, corporations, and personal lives. He noted that an inflated ego always breeds collective possession, nations addicted to power, movements claiming moral purity, groups demanding obedience in the name of identity. The individual's inner tyranny becomes reflected on a global scale. What begins as personal insecurity ends as collective madness. But there is a way out. Not by destroying the ego, that would only deepen the split, but by recognizing it for what it is, a part of you, not the whole of you. Jung urged that freedom begins with observation. To simply notice when the ego is speaking, defending, boasting, or trembling is already an act of liberation. The moment you observe the performance, you are no longer entirely inside it. Imagine a play where the actor suddenly becomes aware they're on stage. The lines lose their automatic power. The actor can pause, breathe, even rewrite the script. That pause, that breath, is consciousness returning. It is the self-reclaiming authority from the tyrant. When you begin to see the ego's movements clearly, something remarkable happens. Compassion replaces contempt. You start to understand that this possession arose not from evil but from fear. The ego inflated because it was once small, wounded, and unprotected. It learned to perform because it believed the truth of who you are wasn't enough. And so, the process of healing is not about destroying the ego but redeeming it. It means teaching the ego to trust again, to surrender its constant need for control and to reconnect with the deeper intelligence of the self. The possessed ego must learn humility, not humiliation, and remember its purpose, to translate inner truth into outer life. As this transformation begins, the old identity starts to crumble. It feels terrifying at first, like death. But what dies is not the self, only the illusion of control. What remains is something quieter, gentler, and infinitely stronger. The ego, once a tyrant, begins to serve as a faithful bridge between the inner and outer worlds. And in that restored balance, the prison dissolves. The walls that were never real vanish into air. The mask loosens, and for the first time, you can breathe. That breath, that first, trembling breath of authenticity, is the beginning of freedom. The Hidden Puppeteers. There are moments in life when you surprise yourself. You say something cruel that you didn't mean, you overreact to a simple remark, or you sabotage an opportunity that you've waited years for. And afterward, you sit in quiet confusion asking, what came over me? Jung had an answer for that question. His answer was both unsettling and liberating. It wasn't you who acted, it was one of your complexes. A complex, Jung explained, is not merely a bad habit or mood. It's a living fragment of the psyche, an autonomous subpersonality born out of emotional experiences you could not fully process. Each complex carries its own feelings, memories, and worldview. It waits, silent, until life touches the old wound that created it. The moment it's triggered, it takes control. For those seconds, or hours, you are no longer yourself. Imagine a confident adult suddenly shrinking into a defensive child when criticized. That's not immaturity, that's possession by the inferiority complex, a ghost from childhood when criticism meant shame or rejection. Or think of a successful professional who turns authoritarian when questioned. That's the power complex, forged in the fires of past helplessness. Jung described these takeovers vividly. We do not have complexes, complexes have us. These inner puppeteers shape far more of life than we realize. They whisper before we speak, react before we think, and retreat before we choose. They live in the shadow, the part of the unconscious that holds everything the ego refuses to see. Each time the ego declares, I'm not like that, another complex takes form, banished yet alive. Repression doesn't destroy these fragments, it feeds them. They grow in darkness, gathering energy until the right stimulus releases them. When this happens, consciousness is hijacked. You might feel an inner heat rise, your pulse quicken, your logic vanish. Later you say, I lost control. But you didn't lose it, it was stolen by an old emotional program that believes it's protecting you. Complexes don't act to hurt you, they act to defend you from pain you once couldn't bear. The tragedy is that their protection now causes the very suffering they were designed to prevent. Take the example of someone who learned early that love must be earned. They carry a pleasing complex that drives them to overgive, over-apologize, and over-adapt. When faced with rejection, this complex flares up, flooding the mind with panic and guilt. The ego feels powerless because, in truth, it is no longer steering the ship. Until this complex is recognized, every relationship will repeat the same pattern: exhaustion, resentment, collapse. Jung compared complexes to little demons within the psyche, not evil, but autonomous. Each one speaks with its own voice, often mimicking reason. You think you're making a rational decision when in reality, you're obeying an unconscious command. That is why people repeat mistakes even after understanding them intellectually. Insight alone doesn't dissolve a complex, awareness must be lived, not merely thought. So how do you reclaim your freedom from these hidden puppeteers? The first step, Jung taught, is observation without judgment. Watch how your emotions shift in certain situations. Notice the pattern, the script that seems to write itself. If every time you succeed you feel guilty, or every time you're criticized you become aggressive, a complex is speaking. Name it gently. There's the fear of failure, or there's the child who wants approval. By naming it, you separate from it. The moment you observe the complex, it loses its absolute power. The second step is compassion. These complexes are not enemies to be exorcised but exiles to be understood. Each one once carried unbearable emotion, grief, humiliation, terror. When you approach them with hostility, they resist. When you approach them with curiosity, they reveal their story. Integration begins the moment you listen instead of suppress. A man who always withdraws during conflict may discover that beneath his silence lies a boy who learned that speaking truth invited violence. A woman who controls everyone around her may find that her dominance hides a terrified child who once felt invisible. When these inner figures are acknowledged, they begin to soften. Their energy, once chaotic, becomes creative. What was once self-sabotage turns into self-knowledge. Yet awareness alone is not the end. Complexes do not vanish, they transform. They remain part of you, but no longer rule you. You learn to feel their stirring and respond differently. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of collapsing into shame, you breathe and choose. That pause, Jung insisted, is where freedom lives, the small space between stimulus and response in which the self can speak. It takes courage to face these inner puppeteers because doing so means confronting the truth that you are not a single, unified being. You are a parliament of voices, some conscious, others forgotten. Maturity is not about silencing them but learning to lead them wisely. A healthy ego becomes a chairperson, not a dictator, listening, integrating, mediating between the parts. When this leadership is restored, something extraordinary occurs. The very forces that once sabotaged your life begin to serve it. The inferiority complex becomes humility, the power complex becomes confidence, the pleasing complex becomes empathy. What were once chains become instruments of depth and compassion. Jung saw this process not as therapy alone but as initiation, a passage from unconscious existence to conscious living. To know your complexes is to reclaim your autonomy. It is to step out of the puppet strings and remember that you are not the play, you are the playwright. And once you see the strings, you can never unsee them. That realization, however unsettling, is the beginning of inner authority. It is the moment the ego, humbled yet awake, begins to recognize the vast inner world it was never meant to control but to serve. That is where real transformation begins, where knowledge becomes awareness, and awareness becomes liberation. The Saboteur Within. You've made a decision, to start the project, to love bravely, to finally change. For a moment, everything feels aligned. Then something invisible tightens inside you. The excitement dulls, distractions appear, and before long, you've retreated to familiar ground. You tell yourself you're lazy, unmotivated, inconsistent. But Jung would have said otherwise. What you're experiencing isn't weakness. It's self-sabotage, the ego's desperate strategy to protect the image it built, even at the expense of your freedom. The ego's original purpose was survival. It evolved to maintain the integrity of consciousness, to anticipate threat, to keep the organism safe. But once those outer dangers pass, the same mechanism begins defending against inner ones, fear of change, fear of uncertainty, fear of losing identity. The ego was never designed to make you happy, it was designed to keep you alive. When you try to expand, it confuses growth with risk. So every step toward authenticity feels, to the ego, like walking into danger. That's why the moment you attempt something new, resistance appears. You begin a creative project and suddenly find 100 reasons to postpone it. You try to build a healthy relationship, and emotional distance sneaks in. You're offered an opportunity to lead, and suddenly you doubt your worth. These are not coincidences. They're the ego's defense systems activating, subtle alarms meant to pull you back to the known territory of your old self. The ego's motto is better the familiar hell than the unknown heaven. To it, comfort equals control. It would rather suffer predictably than risk transformation. And so, it uses the most sophisticated weapon of all, logic. It convinces you that your hesitation is practical, your avoidance reasonable. It disguises fear as wisdom. This is why self-sabotage feels rational in the moment. You aren't fighting laziness, you're negotiating with your own protector. Behind every act of sabotage lies a complex, one of those hidden subpersonalities that Jung described. Each carries a painful memory the ego once buried. When life threatens to repeat that old pain, the complex awakens and hijacks behavior. A person who was shamed for being assertive as a child will later sabotage any attempt to set boundaries. Someone who was told they'd never succeed will unconsciously derail their achievements to avoid confirming the opposite and risking disappointment. In each case, the psyche isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to spare you the unbearable. But protection at this stage has become imprisonment. The ego builds walls around the wound, and those walls block not only pain but also growth, intimacy, and joy. It keeps you inside a life too small for who you are becoming. Jung saw this clearly. When the ego is cut off from the self, it loses its ability to tell reality from projection. It lives inside symbols of safety, routines, identities, roles, mistaking them for truth. Consider the person who lives to please others. Their ego has fused with the image of being kind, helpful, and agreeable. To set a boundary feels like betrayal. To say no feels like cruelty. And so they stay silent, resentful, invisible. They believe they're choosing peace, but what they're actually choosing is psychological survival, obeying a complex that equates rejection with death. Or the overachiever who never stops working. Their inferiority complex whispers that worth must be earned, that rest is failure. They chase excellence endlessly, terrified of being seen as ordinary. Every success brings only brief relief before the next impossible goal looms. The ego calls it ambition. In truth, it is fear wearing a mask of productivity. Self-sabotage, then, is not the enemy of success but the guardian of the old identity. It defends the illusion that you are what you've always been. The moment you try to change that narrative, the ego resists. It would rather destroy progress than lose its throne. Breaking this cycle begins not with force but with awareness. You cannot outfight the ego, it feeds on struggle. What dissolves its power is understanding. Watch your patterns with the calm curiosity of a scientist. Ask, what is this resistance protecting? What image is it trying to preserve? When you identify the fear beneath the behavior, you've already loosened its grip. This awareness shifts the inner dynamic. The ego, once a tyrant, starts to become a partner. You begin to see that it isn't evil, it's frightened. It's the child who learned that vulnerability invites punishment, that failure means shame. When you treat it not as an adversary but as an anxious ally, it starts to relax. Compassion, not confrontation, restores balance. Jung often said that the ego must be educated. Education doesn't mean suppression, it means relationship. Each time you notice a sabotaging impulse and respond with presence instead of panic, the ego learns a new lesson, that truth isn't fatal. That discomfort doesn't equal death. That it can trust the self, the deeper intelligence within you that sees beyond fear. This is the turning point in inner work. Instead of identifying with the saboteur, you begin to observe it. Instead of obeying fear, you dialogue with it. The moment you can say, "There is fear in me, but I am not fear," you reclaim authority. That tiny space between feeling and action is liberation. Gradually, the ego stops defending and starts serving. It becomes the bridge it was always meant to be, translating the quiet voice of the self into conscious choice. Self-sabotage fades not because the ego is conquered, but because it finally feels safe enough to cooperate. The paradox is profound. The freedom you sought outside was waiting inside the very patterns that trapped you. Each act of sabotage was a message in disguise, asking you to meet the parts of yourself you had abandoned. When you do, the walls crumble. And for the first time, the energy once wasted in resistance becomes available for creation, love, and purpose. The ego, humbled and re-educated, learns the truth Jung devoted his life to teaching, that the goal of the journey is not perfection, but wholeness. Only when the ego stops acting as an enemy and becomes an ally can the self truly emerge. And that is the beginning of real mastery, the subject of the next chapter. The mastery of integration. Mastery, as Jung understood it, is not about dominance but harmony, the ego learning to serve the self rather than replace it. It is the final phase of a long inner journey, where the goal is not perfection but wholeness. After confronting the ego's illusions, surviving its possession, and understanding its sabotages, what remains is the art of integration, turning conflict into cooperation, fear into faith, and fragmentation into unity. Most people imagine enlightenment as the elimination of the ego, a glowing state where no shadow remains. Jung thought differently. To him, the ego was not to be killed but educated, strengthened, refined, and connected to something larger. A weak ego collapses under emotion, a healthy one can stand in the fire of experience without losing center. The ego's maturity is what allows the unconscious to express itself safely. Without that grounding, spirituality becomes delusion and power turns to arrogance. Integration begins with humility, the recognition that the ego is not the king of the psyche but a representative of a greater realm. Jung described the self as the organizing center of the total personality, both conscious and unconscious. The ego's rightful role is as its ambassador in the external world. When this relationship is restored, inner authority replaces insecurity. The person no longer seeks validation because they no longer feel separate from their own source. This process, Jung called individuation, the becoming of who you truly are. It unfolds in 3 stages. The first stage is recognition. It begins when you see how much of your life has been ruled by unconscious patterns. The masks, the reactions, the endless need to prove or defend, all of it becomes visible. It's often painful because the illusions that once kept you safe start to collapse. You realize that many of your choices weren't made by a free will but by old fears and complexes. This realization is both shattering and sacred. It's the death of the false center, the moment when you admit, "I am not what I thought I was." The second stage is observation without identification. Here, you learn to witness your inner life without becoming lost in it. Anger arises, but instead of saying, "I am angry," you say, "There is anger in me." Shame surfaces, and you observe it as a passing weather of the psyche. This small linguistic shift changes everything. It introduces space, and in that space, consciousness enters. You begin to practice what Jung called the transcendent function, holding 2 opposites in awareness, the ego and the unconscious, reason and emotion, control and surrender. You no longer fight the shadow, you dialogue with it. You feel pain without being destroyed by it, and joy without being possessed by it. In this stage, the ego slowly loses its arrogance and gains flexibility. It stops clinging to roles and begins to listen. You become the observer of your own performance, aware that both the hero and the villain within you are masks for something deeper. This ability to observe yourself in motion, without denial or shame, is one of the highest human capacities. It is where freedom begins. The third stage is integration. Here, the ego finally aligns with the self. It no longer acts as a tyrant or a victim, but as a mediator, translating inner wisdom into outer action. It learns cooperation, not control. This union gives rise to what Jung called authentic authority, a quiet power that emanates from alignment rather than dominance. Such a person does not need to prove who they are. Their presence itself communicates wholeness. This integrated ego does not seek the spotlight because it no longer needs applause to exist. It leads with calm conviction, speaks truth without aggression, and allows imperfection without collapse. Its confidence comes not from image, but from contact with the self, that inner source of wisdom which Jung saw as both deeply personal and mysteriously universal. To live from this place is to experience a rare serenity. Life's chaos doesn't disappear, but it no longer defines you. Success and failure become teachers, not verdicts. Love becomes a dialogue, not a performance. You can admit fault without shame, and stand firm without pride. This is maturity, the balance between strength and softness, will and surrender. But Jung warned that this mastery is never final. The process of individuation is cyclical, not linear. The ego will forget, inflate, contract, and awaken again. Each return to awareness refines the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Integration is not a state you reach once, it's a rhythm you learn to dance with, a lifelong conversation with your own depths. The reward of this journey is not bliss but authenticity. To be authentic is to live from the center, where the ego and the self move together. The false separations between spiritual and human, divine and flawed, dissolve. You realize that every failure was a step toward understanding, and every wound a doorway into greater wholeness. In that state, authority takes on a new meaning. It's no longer about power over others but power with oneself. It's the silent confidence of someone who knows they are both light and shadow, both limited and infinite. Jung called it the birth of the inner sovereign, not a ruler of people, but a ruler of one's own psyche. In our modern world, obsessed with image and influence, this kind of authority is revolutionary. It doesn't shout, it radiates. It doesn't control, it inspires. And it cannot be imitated because it emerges only through experience, through the courageous act of facing oneself completely. The mastery of integration, then, is not the end of the journey but the beginning of real life. The ego, once fragmented, now bows in service to the self. The performance ends, but the presence remains. You walk through the world not as someone trying to be whole, but as someone who already is. That is what Jung meant by true freedom, not escaping the self, but inhabiting it fully, light, shadow, and all.